Yay, I think we're all in. I see 17.
Delay, but yeah.
Okay.
Let me start screen sharing.
Perfect. Sorry about that, Lawrence. Good morning, everyone. Sorry about all this. I see 17.
Delay, but yeah.
Okay.
Let me start screen sharing.
Perfect. Sorry about that, Lawrence. Good morning, everyone.
Let me start screen sharing.
Perfect. Sorry about that, Lawrence. Good morning, everyone.
Let me start screen sharing. We seem to be caught in a weird
Sorry about that, Lawrence. Good morning, everyone.
Can everyone hear me okay now? Okay, hi everybody, and thanks for all the delays that we've been having. Hopefully we're good to go and we're up and running now. So my name is Lawrence Moroney. I'm a developer advocate here at Google. I work on a couple of technologies, Firebase, where I focus mainly on the growth hacking aspects of Firebase, and Google Maps, so I do a bit of work on them too. But what I want to talk today about is really the habits of highly successful developers and how we've built Firebase the way that we've built it so that you can take advantage of the habits of highly successful developers, that you can follow some of these same habits. And I'll start with some statistics. So 51%, this number is according to surveys that have been done across developer populations. And this survey was towards the end of 2016, so it's a little bit out of date. But 51%, this was the number of developers that we saw as being below the poverty line, where the poverty line is that they are making the equivalent of $500 US a month or less from their applications and from their apps. A similar survey was done 6 months earlier, and it was 48%. Towards the end of 2016, it had grown to 51%. And we're expecting that number to continue growing. This number, 29%, this is the number of developers who are highly successful. And these are developers who are making $5,000 or more per month off of their apps. And we can see that this number is a lot smaller than the 51%. And in addition to this, the trajectory of this number is that it's actually shrinking. And if I put that into a bar chart and take a look at it, this is really what the survey showed to us, that, you know, even though that 51% of developers were making $500 or less a month, the vast majority of them were actually making less than $100 US a month. And when we started looking at the really successful developers, the ones who were making 25K or more per month, we wanted to see, well, what are these people doing? What are some of the things that they take advantage of? What are some of the patterns of development that they have? And like one example that we just saw here was that in that largest bucket of making 25K or plus or more, 88% of these folks were using all three platforms. They were using Android, they were using iOS, and they were using the web. People who tend to focus on a single platform, be it Android or iOS or the web, tended to be in the lower buckets. But the folks who are in that top bucket doing extremely well, you know, that was just one of the habits that they had, was that they were focusing on all three platforms. So it's with these things in mind that we built Firebase. And the idea behind Firebase is that it's a platform, and this platform has a set of services that you can use to enhance your applications, to cut your costs in development, to make it easier for you to build rich apps, to help you to test the quality of your apps and ensure that they're high quality, and also to grow your apps through growth hacking and other methodologies. So this is the platform, and these are the technologies that are in the platform. And we kind of divide it into two columns. The column on the left is really to help you to develop good web apps and to develop good mobile apps. And the columns on the right are for growing these apps. Now, you'll notice that none of these things are a replacement for the Android SDK or your iOS SDKs or your favorite web platform, your favorite web SDKs. These are services that we've built to make it easier for you to develop apps and to do the common things that apps need to do, but for you to be able to use that in a cloud environment that is serverless and is super, super easy to use. And from the Grow perspective, it's really a lot of the things that marketers and developers need to do to be able to grow their apps that they generally might have to do manually. We've been putting a lot of technology to play here, where you can then grow your apps programmatically, and you can start doing some of the things that maybe folks with huge marketing departments have been able to do, but smaller developers have not been able to do. And I'll talk about that a little bit too. But first of all, I just want to talk a little bit about analytics and how all of this is bound together using analytics. The highly successful developer doesn't just build an app and put it out into the market and hope for the best. The highly successful developer has strong analytics behind their applications. They understand what their users are doing with their applications, and they're changing on the fly. They're adapting their apps on the fly to be able to reach their audiences, satisfy their audiences, and delight their audiences so that they can continue to grow their app and be successful. Now, analytics is something that has been in Firebase since we've released it, and we have Google Analytics for Firebase as a product. It's built by the same people that built Google Analytics that you may be familiar with, but it's been really, really tightly optimized for mobile developers and mobile app developers. One of the neat things about it is that you can actually have a really full and rich analytics experience without writing a single line of code. I've spent some time as a development manager, and when I was a development manager, I always had these meetings where, you know, the engineers want one set of analytics so that they can measure the performance of the application. Marketing want one set of analytics so they can see which audiences they've penetrated and which ones they haven't. The business people want one set of analytics to see how much money the application is making and where it's making it. The quality people probably want a different set of analytics so that they can, you know, understand how the application is performing well, where it's doing badly. And the poor development manager is the one who has to try and figure out how to put all of these analytics into the application. And the only compromise is you got to do everything. And usually if you say, well, that's going to delay shipping the application by 6 months in order to do all of these things, you end up doing nothing and shipping the application with no analytics in it whatsoever. So the goal behind Google Analytics for Firebase was really to remove that scenario and say, let's give a common set of analytics that everybody can use of common events that are applicable towards any app, like app open, app close, navigate to this activity, sign in, sign out, those kind of things. And let's get that in a way that works codelessly. So, you know, if you're an Android developer, there's a line that you add to your build.gradle to link in the analytics libraries. If you're an iOS developer, there's a pod that you add to link in the analytics libraries, and that's it. You get that full set of analytics as a result. Now, of course, you can then add custom analytics that are specific to your own application, should you want to do so. For example, if you're writing a game and the boss on level 3 is too difficult, and you put an analytic in there to see how many people drop out after trying the boss on level 3 10 times and failing, and then, you know, stop using your app ever again. You can do that kind of analytic. That's not something that we can figure out ahead of time for you, but that would be a case of where you put a custom analytic in there so that you can measure that. So one of the things that we've released with analytics just recently is this concept that we call Stream View. And it's almost like a live snapshot of how people are using your app right now. And I'm going to switch to a Stream View just so we can take a look at it. So this is the Stream View for an app called Bingo Blast. And Bingo Blast is a casual game that was written by a Googler and is out there. It's got many thousands of users. And with Stream View, we can actually take a look at a heat map of the world of where people are using his app right now. So this is pretty cool. You can see there's a lot of people on the east coast of the US are using it. A lot of people in the UK are using it. A few in Japan, some in Thailand. You know, and so he can really, if, for example, if you'd run a marketing campaign to, for example, maybe get people in Australia to start using this application, he could see that nobody's using it right now. That could also be a time zone thing. So this gives you like the concept of this live snapshot of people using the app right now, which I find is pretty cool. And another really neat thing is that you can do a user snapshot. So if I click on this, what it does is it picks a random user And this user doesn't have any personally identifiable information. You can only tell the type of phone and the rough location of the user. Like here you can see this random user that I picked is in Griswold, Iowa, and they're using an Alcatel phone. And what's really neat about this is that it gives you the ability to kind of remotely look over the shoulder of how somebody is using your application. And so in this case here, you can see some of the analytics that this user has hit. So at 9:26, they initialized the API. So, a few seconds later, they signed in. We triggered the user's logged in analytic. We got the details of the platform as Android, and then the game has you like playing things like spinning slots, starting a session. There are user engagement things. So here's like just a live look-in, so I can actually see how this user is using my application. And I'll just pick another one at random, and this person's only just started. They're not doing anything yet. Here's another one at random, somebody with an unknown device in San Francisco. And this person, I can tell from looking at it, this is a power player who plays a lot because they're hitting things like the Elite Powers analytic. So it's a really nice way for me to tell just how somebody is using my application. And, I can look in to see if the user flows that I want to implement are being implemented by people. In addition to that, there's a debug view, which is a similar live view, so that some devices that are out there, so if there are any devices that are logging debug events, right now none of them have logged it. But if I want to debug my application, if I know there's a fault in my application, I can actually start looking live at how people are using it and see and debug it. I think it's pretty cool, some of the things that can be done. So this is just a few things that can be done with analytics. Of course, there's all the standard stuff that you'd expect from analytics, so that you can see, your population of users, who's spending money, who isn't spending money, that kind of thing. So so all of this data that's generated for you by analytics, of course, you have this console that you can use to take a look at it. But if you really want to slice and dice and go deep into your analytics, they can be exported to BigQuery, and then you can use them in BigQuery. And here's an example of just another analytics. This was one for where we were taking a look at the number of active users of the application and how much money they were spending, as well as crashes that were impacted and the number of errors that caused those crashes. And I always like this slide because there's an urban legend out there that iOS users tend to spend more money than Android users, but there are more Android users. And here's a great example of that, because in Bingo Blast, we see that, at this point, he had 22,000 monthly active users who were spending $2,000, but he had quarter the amount of iOS users, but they were spending $3,000. So this is just another signal into the highly successful developers and what the highly successful developers are doing. And here's a great example of, those highly successful developers are targeting multiple platforms. And in this case, by targeting iOS, he was able to increase his in-app purchases revenue pretty big, significantly. So that's analytics, and how analytics in Firebase really ties everything together. The marketing people in your organization will be delighted when they can start slicing and dicing what people are doing, so that they can figure out how to effectively market your app, or how to effectively market your site. But just remember that analytics drives almost everything in Firebase, and you'll see I'll be using that as a theme a lot as I speak through some of the technologies that are in here. But first of all, let me talk about the backend database, the real-time database. And this is what gave Firebase its name originally. The idea behind this is that almost every application that you build needs to have data on the back end. If you want to have extremely responsive applications, then data that changes the behavior of your application in an event-driven basis will be the one that really gives you that. So let me give an example. If you're familiar with like a SQL stack, like something like MySQL, or a SQL Server stack, that kind of thing, typically the data sits static, and then you have to pull the database with a query to be able to pull a data set back, and then that data set you can then parse through that to change the state of your user interface. The idea behind the real-time database is that it's event-driven, so that if anything changes in the database, an event will be sent to your application that you can respond to. And as a result, you get this very responsive code, and you get these very responsive applications that can update dynamically without you constantly polling a database to see if anything has changed. And the neat thing about that is that then that gives you synchronization, so that if you've got 1 million users and they're all looking at a particular field in the database, once that field in the database changes, that change fans out to all of your users, instead of each of your users at different times having to poll the database to get a value back. And then another benefit of this is the fact that all of the code that you then write is actually in your app. So instead of if you think about it in the traditional database methodology, you have a stack. So for example, a MySQL stack, a LAMP stack for that is that you probably have to write some code, which is SQL queries for reading and writing to the database. You'd write some code that then wraps that to create an API for the mobile layer. You'd write some code on your mobile, which talks to that API layer on the server side. And then you'd have some code that gets the data back from the API layer and then updates your UI with that. So the goal behind all of this is to really remove as much of the friction of doing that as possible, so that you just write code in your application and your application is responsive and updates very quickly. And this works really well, as I mentioned. Like if we all live in a multi-device world, so if you are accessing an application on your laptop via the web app, on your tablet via the mobile app, on your phone, or maybe even your watch via the mobile app as well, then the idea is that data changes can fan out because of this event-based model, and all of your applications will remain in sync. So another thing that when we looked at highly successful developers, we realized that developers who were not successful were spending a lot of time and burning a lot of calories on maintaining and securing the identity of their users, that they had their own authentication mechanisms, that they had to continually update and patch, that they had user stores that they had to continually keep secure from hackers, and all that kind of thing. And when we saw the really successful developers and the really successful apps, that they just turned to federated identity. They said, we don't want to be in the business of maintaining a user store. Everybody has a Facebook account or a Gmail account or a Twitter account or something like that. And why don't we use that kind of federated identity to sign in? And it makes perfect sense, because if all you need to know is that your user is authenticated and their name is Bob Smith, if Facebook can provide that for you, then why not? So the idea behind Firebase Auth is we said, let's create a single API that's easy to use, that then spans multiple sign-in providers like Google, Facebook, Twitter, GitHub, and we're continuing to work on more. As well as integrates with existing auth systems if you have one, so that if you are getting a user token, you can map that user token to a Firebase user token, so you can do everything in Firebase that you would normally do. And then recently, we've just added phone number authentication, because it kind of makes sense that if you have a phone and then that phone has a unique identifier for that phone, which is the phone number, that a user could sign in with their phone number, and you'd have the backend infrastructure to send an SMS to that phone number with a verification code so that you know who they are, and have the user enter that. So we wanted to try and take as much of the coding of that and the maintenance of all of that infrastructure out of your hands and provide you with a single, simple to use API that does all of that for you. And then in addition to that, on top of that, we have a technology called Firebase UI, which is an open source project that you can find on GitHub. And that takes it a step further by managing all of the different flows of user sign up as well as user sign in. So for example, if a user starts running your application and they want to sign in with a Gmail account, but they don't have a Gmail account already, then there's a flow necessary to get somebody to sign up for a Gmail account. And instead of kicking them out of your application to the browser to go to Gmail to sign in, and then maybe they forget about your application by the time that they're done, all of that flow has been implemented for you. It's an open source API built on top of Firebase Auth that can just do all of that, has all the standard user interface widgets, and all of the research that we in Google have put into making as friction-free a sign up and sign in as possible is in there, including things like smart lock for passwords, that if you're an Android user, you're probably familiar with this, where you can sign in once, save your credentials to smart lock, and then continue to sign in using those credentials from smart lock. So again, all of these kind of things that reduces friction for your users, keeps your users secure, and it's an API, which is, by the way, it's totally free to use. There's no cost associated with this, and allow you to hit the habits of highly successful developers instead of spending a lot of time and money to build your own user stores. When we first released Firebase, one of the things that the #1 requirement that we had was that it was really great to be able to do all of this stuff in the mobile app, to have like all the code, for example, like with the database I was talking about earlier running in the mobile app. But sometimes there are things that you need to do on the back end on the server. Like maybe an analytics event, some things change in an audience in analytics and you want some intelligence behind that. Or maybe once a user has signed up and signed in for the first time, and the backend server knows that the user has signed in for the first time, that you want to trigger a notification that sends them a welcome message. So as a result, there's a lot of stuff that would be needed on a backend there. But we wanted to continue the theme of codeless middleware, so that you're not building and maintaining cloud servers or web servers or anything like that. But if you want to run some raw code and logic, typically you would need to have some kind of a backend. And that's why we came up with Firebase Functions. So the idea behind this is that you write JavaScript code, it's Node.js code, you store it in Firebase, but you don't worry about a server. You're not signing into a server and deploying code to the server. You're basically just writing functions that Firebase manages the server backend for you. And if you can think of like common backend events like database changes, authentication changes, analytics changes that might want to trigger some kind of a workflow, that's what Functions is all about. And it gives you that really nice hybrid of being able to do some stuff on the backend without managing a backend server. Firebase hosting is another one. It's one of my favorites. And when we go back to the highly successful developers, almost every time when you want to build an app and you want to put an app into the Play Store, or if you want to put an app into the App Store, you need a website associated with that app. And then that typically means somebody in your organization has to go and rent web space, has to get a domain name, has to map the domain name to that web space, has to upload files. Maybe they use FTP, maybe they have their own console, who knows. And it's a lot of work and it's a lot of calories that you have to burn to sometimes even just put together a single page website that says, this is our app, here's some screenshots, here's our contact link. So we said, okay, this is something that we can reduce a lot of the friction for you. And so we built hosting into Firebase as well. So directly from your Firebase console, you can build a website, you can map a domain name to it, all those kind of goodies. But the neat thing is that then this website is hosted in the cloud. It's edge cached. It's hosted on some of the fastest servers in the world. And I want to actually give a quick demo of that just to show an example of how fast it can be. So if I go to my browser for a second, now as a hobby, I do the 3D graphics generation, and so I do some art behind that. And the biggest picture that I could render when I was doing my art was a 10,000 by 10,000 pixel image. So that's 100 million pixels. So I took this image with 100 million pixels in it and I stored it on Firebase hosting. And you can see the live URL here. So if you want to go to it yourself, it's fh-screencast.firebaseapp.com. And if I hit enter on that, now we can see the 100 million pixel image just downloaded. And it's almost instantaneous where we see it. And okay, I cheated a little bit, so I'm using a technology here called OpenSeaDragon, because Firebase hosting allows you to store things like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, of course, graphic images like this one. And what OpenSeaDragon did was that it sliced this image up into tiles at different zoom levels. So what I've downloaded here is probably about an 800 by 800 copy of the image, the relevant tiles that OpenSeaDragon produced for me, so that I got a quick responsive download. But just to show that it really is a 100 million pixel image, if I zoom in on this character's eye, you can actually see the details such as individual eyelashes, but you can also see the reflection in the eye of what was behind the virtual camera in this room that she's standing in when I rendered it. So even reflections like that. So this is a 100 million pixel image. Or if I do things like there are monitors in the background behind her, I don't know how well this will show up on the live stream. But if I zoom in on them, you can actually start reading some of the writing on these monitors, like it says comparative precious metals here, that type of thing. So this is a site that I built with this 100 million pixel image hosted on Firebase hosting, just to show you how fast and responsive Firebase hosting is. I think it's pretty cool. Okay, so moving on. Firebase storage is the next part. So if you want to host files on behalf of your users, you need a place where you can store them. So for example, if you're building the next photo sharing app or the next video sharing app, and your users put files into your system, you need to store them somewhere. You need to store them securely, and you need to store them in a way that only the right people have access to them based on a set of rules. And also, if the files are pretty big, the problem with a mobile environment is people move around, connectivity statistics change. You might have a strong connection 1 minute, but you walk 100 yards and then you have a weak connection. And if you're uploading and downloading large files, things can happen where the connection can get lost, and you don't want the file transfer to get lost. You want to be able to resume it when you have a stronger connection again. And that's generally a lot of code in handshaking that you'd have to write to be able to do this kind of thing. So the reason the highly successful developers have done this already, and we said, hey, in Firebase, why don't we give this facility to everybody? And that's the idea behind the storage API. You can store large files, upload, download, access them. But it's not just simply a simple file storage thing. It also has all of that handshaking so that you can manage large files, you can manage multiple files, that kind of thing, without you having to write and maintain a lot of code to do that. It's something that the API does for you. So those are some of the services that we realize that highly successful developers have. Maybe they've built them themselves, maybe they've bought them, and we wanted to put it out there so that everybody can use it. They're mostly free. The database, and there are different tiers in Firebase where, you know, almost everything you get, like one level of it for free. If you go to the pricing, you'll see that when you become a heavier user, then there are charges associated with that. Some of them are always free, like authentication, for example, is always free, except the phone off part where because an SMS has to be sent with a verification code, there's like different charges in different countries for that SMS. But again, there's a free tier for that. So the idea is if you're a startup, if you want to get up and running quickly, if you want to, have all of these services available to you quickly, then we wanted to, help you build high quality apps that you can get out there fast, and that you have the same habits that the highly successful developers do. And talking about quality, that's the next part. So the number one reason why you get a bad review in an App Store or the Play Store for your app is generally a crash. All you have to do is like cruise the App Store and look at reviews, and almost every time you'll see a 1-star or a set of 1-star reviews on an application. Is like, I spent 15 minutes downloading this, I ate my bandwidth, I launched it, it crashed right away. So we wanted to build crash reporting into, and we also now have Crashlytics as we move forward, but crash reporting has been built into Firebase, with the idea being that this gives you the facility to remotely check on crashes to your application. The one example I always like to give is I've built a casual game, and I was speaking at a conference in Korea last year, and I just wanted to make sure that this game would work in Korea. So I sent the APK of the game to one of my colleagues in Korea. She tested it out. It crashed immediately upon launching. And instead of me getting on a plane and going to Korea and testing it in Korea or testing it on a Korean phone, I was able to see basically a full stack trace of why my app crashed on our phone. And I realized that I had an issue with Korean fonts if the phone had native Korean fonts, and I was able to fix that without me needing to travel out there. So I could effectively, usually when you get a crash, you like to see your stack trace, you like to see, where along your stack trace the crash happened, and from that you can figure it out and fix it. This gives you the ability to do that remotely. Also, it's integrated with analytics. I've been talking about analytics a lot, and the really neat thing about this is that if you have 1 million users out there and 10,000 of them are having crashes, you can start defining analytics audiences so that you can start matching crashes to audiences to really help you drill down why something is crashing for a particular audience. So you might be able to fix bugs en masse. Performance monitoring is related to that. It's a very similar thing, with the idea being that you can take a look at how your app is performing in different places around the world, and again, have it driven by analytics. So like in this chart here, I find it's really interesting that if you look at, in this case, we saw network response latency, and the app was doing really, really well in the network in every country except Sweden, and I think that's Ethiopia. So then as a result, we could start drilling down into, well, let's take a look at, let's build an audience of Swedish users, let's take a look at what they're doing. Let's maybe try and find and identify what might be causing network response latency issues in Sweden, so that we can fix that and get better reviews and have a better experience for our app developers who happen to be in Sweden. And then Test Lab for Android is the final part of the quality ones. And this one's really neat in that Android has an opportunity as well as a problem in that there's such a diversity of devices. When you're building for iOS, there generally is relatively few devices, but when you're building for Android, every country in the world has a different set of devices, and there's a huge variety of Android devices out there. So if you're going to build an application for Android and you want to make sure that it works on all devices, what do? You buy an instance of every single device and test it yourself. You could do that, but it's a management overhead. It's a bit of a nightmare. What we at Google decided that let's build a data center that contains either virtual or physical instances of many common devices. Sometimes for example, I've spoken with developers in China who wanted to test a new application on a Pixel,
and the Pixel wasn't available in China, and they literally had to fly somebody over to the USA to buy a Pixel, fly back to China so they could test it on it. The idea behind Test Lab for Android is that you're saving all that time and effort and expense, and you can just upload your APK to our data centers and then perform a number of tests on your APK and see how your application responds. It's pretty neat in that there are robo tests where, for example, if you've got a sign-in button on your application, it will automatically try to sign in and use dummy accounts that are created for the robo tests, and just manage testing your entire application by pushing buttons, navigating between activities, taking a look at what happens. It gives you a video report. It gives you like a flowchart report of everything that happened with screenshots, and it gives you like stack trace so you can see bugs and crashes and all that kind of thing. It's actually pretty cool. And if the robo tests aren't enough, you can actually design your own tests and upload them along with your APK, and the engine will run those tests for you. So if there's something custom that you want to do, like the boss on level 3 that I was talking about earlier on, if you want to test that, how does the level 3 of your game work on different devices, on tablets, and different orientations, without you actually buying those things, then that's something that you can design with Test Lab. It's a really cool technology if you're an Android developer, and it's something that I think you definitely need to be able to reach as big an audience as possible. So on to growth hacking and some of the technologies that are in here for growth hacking. I know we're a little short on time, so I'm going to go through these a little quicker. So cloud messaging, the idea behind this is that notifications, of course, are a vital way of engaging and re-engaging with your users. But the worst possible thing you can do with your users is send notifications that they don't want. So the idea behind cloud messaging was that we wanted to have a notification system that is incredibly fast and incredibly responsive, but also a notification system that's driven off of analytics, so you only send notifications to the right people at the right time. So first of all, when it comes to the speed of it, in November of last year, we announced that we're sending about 1 trillion messages per week over this infrastructure, and about 98% of those messages are received in 500 milliseconds or less on connected devices. And so it's a really fast infrastructure and a really reliable infrastructure. But then when it comes to targeting and picking how you're going to send those notifications, obviously there's analytics and some really powerful analytics tools, but there's also things such as topics. So you can create a topic, and if your user is subscribed to that topic, it's like an opt-in analytic almost. Then they can, when you send a message, you can just send it to that topic, and then users who are subscribed to that topic will receive it. And we handle all that back-end logics for you, so that it makes it easier for you to send the right message at the right time to the right person. App indexing is one of my favorites, and this is it's almost criminally underused because the advantages that this gives you are fabulous. The idea behind app indexing is that if somebody has taken the time and effort to install your app, and there's content in your app that they would generally like to consume, then when as part of their daily workflow or multiple times a day workflow, if they're searching Google for that content, it makes logical sense that they would want to see that content in your app because they've already made the investment of installing your app. And that's the idea behind app indexing. So it's very simple in that you create a link between your site and your app, and using an assetlinks.json file for Android or iOS universal links for iOS. And each of these specify the package name of your app. And then when the Google Spider is crawling the web and indexing the content for your site, it sees that and it knows that that app is associated with it. So then if in the future a user is searching for that content, your app is installed on it, then they'll be able to launch it directly in your app. So you can continue to re-engage with the users, and as a result, your app isn't one of those that's lost when the user upgrades their phone or they install it and they forget about it. It's a way to continually re-engage with them and continually, grow your users, grow how your users will be using your app, so that they can become future purchasers and all those type of things. Another favorite of mine is remote config. And if you think about remote config, the idea behind this is that it's a variable that's stored on the server side that's driven off of analytics. So the way I like to look at this is, say, take for example, if you're building an e-commerce application and you want to have a standard discount for your users in your e-commerce application, and say that standard discount is 0%, so that everybody gets the correct price. But you realize that you don't really have as big an audience in Canada as you want to have. So then you could say, you know what, for Canadians, we'll give a discount. Let's give a standard discount of 10% to Canadians. And then you realize in Mexico, you know, you really want to grow in Mexico, so you're going to give a 20% discount to people in Mexico who are using your application. And you'd have to do all this if-then logic. If user is in this country, set to 0. If user is in that country, set to 10. If user is in another country, set to 20. All that type of stuff. And you'd have to shift that logic in your application. And then as suddenly you have huge growth in Mexico and you want to get rid of the 20% discount, you'd have to change the logic and ship yet another version of your application. So the idea behind remote config is you have a single variable. In this case, it's your standard discount. And you set the value of that variable using analytics. So on Firebase, you would say, you know, default value equals 0, users in Canada equals 10, users in Mexico equals 20. And then when the application is running live, it's reading from remote config. People in Mexico are getting the value 20, people in Canada are getting the value 10, and then in your app, you set the discount accordingly. And if you reach the scenario then where you got lots and lots of people in Mexico using it, you can't afford to give the 20% discount anymore, you make one change on the console, you don't ship a new application, and people get the new behavior found out instantly. So that's really what remote config is all about. It allows you to remotely configure the behavior of your application, and it's driven off of analytics, which makes it really cool. Dynamic links are there for users to invite other users to your application, and they work alongside Firebase invites. I like to talk about the two of these together because it kind of makes sense. So the best way that people discover apps is through word of mouth. Friends help friends discover great content. And but if you try to share something with somebody, how do you generally do it? It's like you might speak to them and say, hey, I found this great app that does blah, 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 blah. And there's a lot of friction then for them to find that app in the store, download that app, hopefully it's the right one, go to the content in that app that you're talking about. So the idea is that like a lot of apps have a link that's built into them that allow you to share a link to the app, you know, in the Play Store or in the App Store, which reduces some of the friction. But even then, there's still a lot of friction associated with that because, say, for example, it's a recipe app and you want to share a recipe with your friends, then if there's just a link to the app in the store and they don't have the app already installed, they still need to go through the install flow and then go back to talk to you to say, hey, what was that recipe, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea with dynamic links in an invite is that the context of the share is maintained even if the app isn't installed. So for example, if I'm sharing a recipe for lasagna with you that I really enjoy, and I send you an invite with a dynamic link in it, then the idea is if you have the app already and you touch on the link, you will launch and get taken directly to that recipe. If you don't have the app already, after you've installed it and you launch, you'll be taken directly to that recipe. So it's pretty cool, like, you know, how it reduces all of that friction. And then invites reduces the friction even further in that, you know, if you touch on a share link with something, the average person has about 300 contacts. My surname begins with M, so it's halfway through the alphabet. So if you're wanting to share with me, you know, on average, if the list was alphabetically sorted, you'd have to go through 150 people before you find me to be able to share it with me. So the goal behind Firebase Invites is there's a lot of machine learning and AI behind the scenes in this that looks at your overall sharing behavior and your friends and that type of thing, and bubbles the ones who are most likely to want to receive this to the top of the list. So for example, if you share a lot of apps with me and I accept those shares, I'm going to be #1 on your list. Or if, you know, I have a lot of recipe apps and you want to share a recipe app, I'm going to be high on your list. Those kind of things. And or if you share a lot, you know, with particular people, those people bubble up to the top of your list. So again, reducing friction so that me as an app developer, now I know that my population of users have as little friction as possible in sharing my app with their friends. So advertising and universal ad campaigns. So the idea is with AdMob and Firebase, if you want to advertise your app and grow your app that way, then the idea is using universal app campaigns. The advert for your app can appear in multiple Google properties, such as Google Search, Google Mobile Search, YouTube, that kind of thing, and listings in the Play Store, et cetera, et cetera. And then with AdWords in your application, and if you use AdMob in your application, the idea is that that's something that can really help you make money off your application by delivering the right adverts to your user population based on their requirements and based on their needs. So that's it for this summary of Firebase. To learn more, there's a couple of links that you can go to here, g.co/firebase/prezo, and there are code labs that you can use to learn, you know, to get hands-on. There's one code lab called Friendly Chat that I strongly recommend you work your way through. It'll probably take about half a day to go through it, and it touches on most of the aspects of Firebase. So you use remote config, you use the real-time database, you use authentication, all those kind of stuff, and it just shows how easy it is to run. So with that, I'll say thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lawrence. And this is Gaia, everyone. I'd like to apologize again for the delay in starting. And we actually have a short question and answer session right now. If you'd like, you can start typing your questions in the chat section. And Lawrence, I actually have one that we got already. I can read that out to you. That's from Michael Klimchek. It says, what is the strategy to unsubscribe from Firebase Cloud Messaging? For example, when a user is logging out, he should no longer get messages targeted at him. And then he has a link to a Stack Overflow article that I can paste in the chat.
Sure. If your app is no longer, I'm going to talk on Android. So if your app is running and in the background, then of course you will, you can still receive notifications. If your app is not running, so if you've killed the process, you shouldn't be receiving notifications. But if you want to sign out of your app, I'm thinking the best strategy for that would be if you generally, what I recommend is to think in terms of topics and have your users subscribe to topics for messages that they want to receive. And you can store the topics that a user is using in the database. And when you sign out, you could explicitly unsubscribe that user from those topics. And in the future, when they sign in again, read the topics from the database that they're interested in and resubscribe to them. So then topic-based messaging wouldn't reach that user because they've explicitly unsubscribed from those topics. That would be, I think, a good strategy for this.
Okay, that's great. Lawrence, there's another question from Renato in the live chat. It says, can I configure the amount of data being synchronized from Firebase to the device? If I have a large real-time database, all the data will be on the device also.
User rules can be used for that. So if the idea is that you can set up your user rules so that they only the relevant data is accessible by that user, and as a result, then that's the only data that would be synchronized to the device for offline stuff instead of the entire data set. That would be the number one thing that I would say that you should do in that case.
I don't see any other questions here. We'll give this another minute. Oh, here we have another one. Is there any other way to create, this is from Powell, is there any way to create custom Firebase authenticator? For example, to log in user with email and short PIN. I know it's not really safe, but still.
Yeah, so at the moment, the way that you would do that, unfortunately, is that you would have your own authentication system so for example, with the user and short PIN that you mentioned here, and then in your own authentication system, that would generate some kind of user ID, and then you can map that user ID to a Firebase user so that they then get logged into Firebase with a Firebase user ID. And then all of the security attributes of the Firebase user ID, so user roles and those kind of things you set up in the database, you could map to your custom user. But you wouldn't be using the Firebase auth directly. You'd be creating and maintaining your own user store and mapping the IDs to each other.
Okay. All right, cool. One more from Triambek. It says, for how long can we expect to get Firebase support? Actually, it happens that we have integrated, and again, after a few months, we have to roll back and switch to, say, another technology.
Yeah, my understanding is Firebase support will be around as long as Firebase is, and hopefully that's for a very, very long time. And I'm not really clued up on the specifics of how support works, but I'm pretty sure that as a Firebase customer, you have a number of support tickets. Just go to firebase.google.com/support and take a look there what the terms that they have are. But as long as we have Firebase and as long as you're using Firebase, we do have support for that.
All right, very cool. And another one from Victor.
Yeah, I can see it in the chat window. So
oh, sorry. Oh, perfect. Oh, that's right.
The strategy for Firebase Analytics and Google Analytics. So that's a really good question. So Google Analytics for Firebase is written by the same people as Google Analytics. It's the same team building both products. We recommend that if you're building a mobile application to use Google Analytics for Firebase because it's really been optimized for mobile use. There's no reason why you can't use both, or if you want to use both, there's no reason why not. But like all the stuff that we've been talking about, and I'm more of an expert in Google Analytics for Firebase than Google Analytics itself. So this may be partially the blind leading the blind. But you know, my recommendation would be if you're only going to use one, use Google Analytics for Firebase. So the next one: are there any Firebase products that are not backed by Google Cloud? I guess some of the products that don't have a cloud infrastructure on the back end will be the only ones here. For example, something like app indexing that I mentioned earlier on, that's entirely client side. So it's code that you write on the client side that manages incoming links from the Google search app, as well as stuff that you put onto your site. But in general, you know, the back-end infrastructure for this is stuff that, you know, we use our own cloud for that. And yeah, that would be, it's Google Cloud backed, but unless, of course, the technology itself doesn't need anything cloud like app indexing. So that's for Daniel. The next question for Triambach is there any future plans to add pricing to the support? If you mean, are we going to start charging for the support, then I don't know of any future plans for that. But we don't speculate on any future plans, so I don't know. But it's our philosophy to make sure that that's always free. Okay, so from Victor, is there a time frame for the integration of Crashlytics and Firebase using a single SDK? So I can give a very broad time frame for that. We don't share a specific one, but at Google I/O, we did announce that Crashlytics should be the #1 way that you use going forward for crash management in this, and that we should be announcing a release of that before the end of this calendar year.
Cool. Thanks so much, Lawrence. I don't see any other questions here. So, yep, I don't see any more. The last call for questions, everyone.
5, 4,
2, and 1. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you so much, Lawrence, for your time.
You're very welcome. If anybody wants to reach out to me with any questions, if they haven't thought of any now, you can reach out to me on Twitter. It's @lmaroney. And well, strongly where I recommend that you reach out, it's firebase.google.com/support for anything detailed. And you know, to go and check that out there. Oh, there's one more question.
One last question, yes.
Can we divide users according to certain criteria? So in analytics, you can create audiences of users. So yes, with those criteria. So for example, you know, when I was talking about remote config earlier on, you know, I used the criteria of country. So, you know, users in Canada get this discount, users in Mexico get that discount, that kind of stuff. So definitely just take a look at Google Analytics for Firebase and how you can define audiences in that. And then those audiences can be used for other things as well, like I said, remote config or cloud messaging and that kind of. So yeah, so reach out to me on Twitter with any other questions. But anything detailed, anything specific to your application, that kind of thing, I'd strongly recommend firebase.google.com/support.
Perfect. All right. Thank you all so much. And I believe Niharika had shared out a feedback form. So if you could fill that out, that would be greatly appreciated as well.
Only if the feedback's good.
Yes, oh, absolutely. Well, thank you, everyone, and have a lovely rest of the day and evening wherever you are.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.